the Gold Coast and Gold Coast libraries. I hope you're all staying safe and well during these interesting times. My name is Meg Keneally, and thank you for inviting me to talk about my new book, The Wreck. This is the story of a girl called Sarah McCaffrey, who attends a peaceful protest in Manchester in 1819, which turns very, very violent after the government sends in troops to attack the men and women and children who are listening to it talk. Sarah's parents are among those killed, and she is radicalised by a man who is plotting to overthrow the government. That plot fails, and she escapes on a ship bound for New South Wales, which is wrecked just outside of Sydney Harbour. She's the sole survivor. When she wakes up in hospital, she's taken in by a woman called Molly Thistle, who is a successful businesswoman in the colony at a time when female leadership and successful businesswomen were not welcome. And through her friendship with Molly Thistle, she discovers there are better ways to change the world. Now, some of that might sound a bit outlandish, especially the part about her being the sole survivor of a shipwreck. But in fact, this story is based on elements of history which actually occurred. The massacre in which Sarah loses her parents is closely based on an event known as the Peterloo Massacre, which occurred in August 1819 in Manchester, when upwards of 60,000 people who were there to listen to a talk about parliamentary reform. And it was a family day. People brought picnics, they were singing, they were dancing, they were waving banners, and they were just there to listen to a man called Henry Hunt talk about parliamentary reform and suffrage. The magistrates were really alarmed by the number of people who showed up. They were already nervous about the public mood and feared that there might be an uprising. So they sent in the hussars, and all of these, innocent people looked up to see these sabres swinging down towards them. And by the end of the day, 20 people were dead and hundreds injured. And I always like, when I'm writing historical fiction, to look for events which have a resonance with today. And I think suppression of peaceful protest, as that event undoubtedly was, is something which we are still unfortunately seeing reverberate in our society today. Now, it might also sound outlandish to have a plot where the plotters are intending to behead the cabinet ministers and declare a provisional government. But again, that aspect of the story is based on something that actually occurred less than a year after the Peterloo Massacre, involving some people who were there. A group of radicals hatched a plan to storm a cabinet dinner, behead the cabinet, and form a provisional government. One of their number was a police spy, though, so they were arrested before that could occur, as everyone but Sarah is arrested when their plot goes wrong. As for the sole survivor of a shipwreck, my wreck in the book is based on another event. The wreck of the Dunbar, just outside of Sydney Harbour, near a place called the Gap. This occurred a couple of decades after when I'm writing, but it's always fascinated because I'm really keen on scuba diving, and I'm fascinated by shipwrecks and maritime history. I just love it. And I've dived a number of times on the site where the Dunbar was wrecked. And after a storm, you often find, or you can find, bolts, for example, tea tokens, belt buckles, coins. And the wreck of the Dunbar remains the deadliest wreck in New South Wales maritime history. And there was one survivor, a man who was thrown onto the rocks, a midshipman, and rescued sometime later. And the final element of the story, the character of Molly Thistle, is also based on someone who actually lived. If you look on your $20 note, you'll see a grandmotherly looking woman in a lace cap. Her name is Mary Reeby, and she was transported for stealing a horse at the age of 14, got married. After her husband died, she built his business into this massive trade and real estate empire. And she's always fascinated me because I've always wondered what it must have taken, what her personality must have been like to be able to build such an influential business as a former convict and as a woman in a society where both were sort of shunned. So I've been looking for a long time for opportunities to write about all of these events. I find them all fascinating. And Sarah, my character, is the young woman who threads them all together for me. And I also wanted to write about someone like her because she starts off as disaffected, which is why she's attending this talk. But when her parents are killed, she becomes a very easy target for radicalisation. And she goes into a very dark place seeking revenge for the death of her family. And it's only through the faith and care of somebody else that she begins to step into the light again. And I was fascinated by the aspects of that journey as well, from oppressed to radicalisation and then back into something which is more positive and a more optimistic way of changing the world. So this story is set in 1820 and half of it is set in 1820 Sydney, when Sydney was really a colony on the brink. It was a convict colony, but it was beginning to transform into something more, beginning to transform into a vibrant mercantile city as well. So I was also really fascinated to write about Sydney at that stage because it really was a society on the cusp. But I keep coming back to my great loves, the sea and maritime history. And so I wanted to read you a little bit from the wreck, and this takes place in the middle of the process of the actual wrecking of the ship. I won't read you the whole wreck scene because we'd be here for too long. But where I'm about to pick up, the ship is in the middle of a violent storm, as the Dunbar was, before it was driven into the cliffs at the Gap. The ship is in the middle of a violent storm, and the crew is having a lot of trouble steering it. Now, there's a reason for that, a very nefarious reason why they can't steer it, but I'll let you discover that for yourself when you read it. And I'm about to pick up with the captain desperately trying to steer the ship. The captain's name is Watkins, and Sarah and her friend Maisie deciding whether they will survive if they remain on board and trying to figure out whether they're better off in the ocean. So here we go. Watkins was still shouting commands at sailors who might already be dead while he hauled on the wheel as though steering from the cliffs would make any difference now. Coombs had somehow clambered back aboard during the last lurch and was pulling people to relative safety in the middle of the deck. Sarah heard a low groan. At first she thought it might be from a passenger, but this sound, long and undulating, was loud enough to be heard well above the wind. It was followed by a crack and the mainmast toppled across the deck towards the bow. One of the oldest sailors was pinned, unmoving. The sails came down too, the first shroud for a few other bodies that had not yet been washed over. Sarah took Maisie by the shoulders. "Can you swim?" Maisie stared back with blank eyes. "Maisie, can you swim?" "Yes, but we're safer here than in the ocean, aren't we?" "No, dear, there we might at least have a chance." Maisie looked over the rail into the churning water, then looked back at Sarah. Her eyes were not fixed on anything. Her mouth was slack. Another wave hit the ship and more people lost their footing, slipping towards the gap in the starboard rail, their hands scrabbling, using the last air in their lungs to scream, nails uselessly digging into the deck as they slid over the side. There was maybe a minute until the next wave hit. Each one wrapped around more ankles, filled more mouths and noses, tugged more people into the sea. "You must trust me," Sarah told Maisie. "We are going over here now." She half helped, half dragged her friend towards the gap in the rail created by the first impact. When Maisie saw where they were going, she began shaking her head, pulling backwards. "No," she said. "No, no, 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 no." Each syllable was longer, more guttural than the one before, until the last came out in a moan. It was a matter of seconds before the next wave hit. Sarah put her arms around Maisie and Maisie put her head on Sarah's shoulder. "Dear heart, I am sorry, but we will die if we stay here," she said, and then stepped sideways into the air, taking Maisie with her. The freezing water ripped them from each other. Sarah emerged into air so thick with vapour it hardly deserved the name. She whipped her head around looking for Maisie, wanting to tear her hair out as it slapped across her face, filling her mouth. She croaked out her friend's name, knowing she had no hope of being heard over the gale, the crash of the waves and the screams from the ship. The current had taken her towards the stern. It had taken others too. A woman floated face down, her skirts billowing slightly with air trapped beneath them as they gradually took on water. A man with a badly grazed face, Reverend Simpkin it looked like, was face up, his eyes open towards the thick clouds in what were becoming less visible as dusk began to draw in. The bodies were surrounded by chunks of wood and clothes that had burst from a passenger's trunk. In the middle of them was the convict boy she had seen on deck. His presence told her that the hold had been ripped open and that at least some of the prisoners had not been rail-ironed for the night. The lack of irons had not helped the lad, though. The ocean rolled him over and wrapped him in a stray skirt, the closest he would come to a shroud. Another large wave was coming now. Sarah could just see its white ridge. She swam frantically against the current, making little headway, but enough to keep from being between the ship and the shore when the wave hit. It curled over her, cutting off the sound of the wind as it span her around, shoved her down, and finally let her go, just as the burning in her chest was becoming unbearable. Again, she wheeled around looking for Maisie. She grasped at a passing piece of wooden plank, hardly noticing when its splintered edge grazed her palm. She only realised she was bleeding at the sting of salt water. She was dangerously close to the listing ship. Smaller waves, foot soldiers of the monsters taking the vessel apart, slapped her in the face as once more she swam against the current that was sweeping more detritus towards her. She refused to accept that some of the shapeless objects might be human, might be Maisie. A sliver of white peeked out from behind a barrel. She began kicking again, and while she didn't seem able to move forward, she could at least hold her position until the barrel and its passenger reached her. Maisie was as pallid as the boy had been, but she had retained enough awareness to cling onto the barrel. As it passed by, Sarah let go of the plank and grabbed the barrel opposite Maisie, who gaped at her, this familiar face that had suddenly appeared from the ocean. Sarah, in spite of everything, started to laugh, a dry coughing sound. She reached across the barrel and squeezed Maisie's arm. "We just need to hold on. We will hold on and stay above the water until we're rescued, yes?" She did not know whether Maisie was capable of answering, but the young woman was clearly still capable of seeing, as her eyes fixed on a point above Sarah's shoulder. They were clear of the stern, and another wave lifted the barrel and sent the serpent rolling towards the cliff again. The impact this time was too much for the mizzenmast, which fell, overbalanced across the stern and crashed into the water, creating a wave that swamped the barrel. Sarah risked taking one hand off the wood to wipe her eyes. When she opened them, she was alone. She croaked out Maisie's name. No light was coming from the crippled ship and precious little from the sky, so Sarah did not see the next wave until it was almost upon her, a shelf of black, angry water, flinging her and the barrel towards the rocks. So that is the eponymous wreck. And it might seem that I've over-dramatised it with tales of bodies floating in the water and so forth. But I actually based a lot of that on a pamphlet that was published after the wreck of the Dunbar, which described scenes like that. It was such a catastrophic event. So many people in Sydney at the time knew someone who had died, would have had family members or friends on board. And the morning after the wreck, they all went to the wreck of the Dunbar, they all went to the Gap and looked over and saw bodies and parts of bodies and cargo and sails just being whipped around and rolled around by the sea. It was a really, really desperately horrible event for a small town the size of Sydney at the time. And to give you a sense of the violence of the impact, to research this book, I did course, at the National Maritime Museum, and they brought out a tray of artefacts divers had found from the Dunbar, and myself, whenever I've found anything from the Dunbar, I've given it to the Maritime Museum as well, and most people do. And one of the things I held in my hand was a bolt that was about that thick that had held the hull together, which was bent into an S shape. The force was enough to just concertina it. It was quite an extraordinary wreck, and as I said, it remains New South Wales's deadliest maritime disaster. I hope you enjoyed that reading. I hope you get a chance to read the book and that you enjoy it. Thank you very much to Gold Coast Libraries for having me, and to you for listening, and stay safe and well. Thanks a lot.